Tomorrow is Valentine's Day, the day to celebrate love. I was talking with a friend recently as she recounted one Valentine's Day in college where the love was in abundance. Early that morning, the doorbell rang and a florist dropped off a beautiful bouquet of her favorite flower, stargazer lilies, with a card signed from a guy who lived several states away. Around lunchtime, as the doorbell rang again, she saw from the window another nice guy with whom she'd been spending some time, holding another gorgeous vase filled with her favorites. Before opening the door, she quickly stashed the first vase behind the shower curtain and received the second graciously. Midday, she received a phone call that another young man who thought she was pretty great was on his way over. Well, if you know anything about lilies, they are a very strong fragrance. So she stashed one vase in the dryer and the other in the washing machine and shut the lids. The third doorbell ring of the day came with a lovely bouquet of roses and a box of chocolates. But the funny thing was that the date of the day was set for that night. So the roses went to their place behind the shower curtain before suitor number 4 showed up with a fourth arrangement. Now, that's certainly one kind of abounding love, young love trying to woo another with flowers and candy, and perhaps there is such a thing as too much of a good thing there. But as I get to wrap up our From the Heart series, we will look today at a love far greater and far more abundant than 4 beautiful bouquets of flowers. While a most basic idea, God's love for us to know, to experience, and to share is a message worth being reminded of time and time again. As I mentioned in the children's sermon, today's key passage is also our children's ministry vision statement. And so as we consider what it means to have love abounding, hear this beautiful prayer written for the Philippians again. Hear it for our children, but also hear it for yourself, no matter your age or stage of life. And this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless until the day of Christ, filled with fruits of righteousness that come through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. This prayer is that your love will abound more and more. In some translations, it says that you will overflow more and more with love for others. Paul is praying that God will take this love that you have and make it grow to overflowing. When you're talking about plumbing, overflowing is a bad thing. But in the case of love, overflowing means it can reach farther, it can spread beyond, and there is more than enough to share. This kind of love will keep on growing in spiritual knowledge and in insight so that we can discern what is best. We make a zillion micro decisions every day, with a few huge ones thrown in. But those small choices require that we discern what is best with each one, because the combination of those small decisions, one on top of another, make up life. And this kind of love has a purity that sets followers apart from the culture around them. There should be a difference in how followers of Jesus live and love because God is at work in them. This love causes them to relate to the world differently than those who aren't following Jesus. Wisdom and discernment play out in these relationships, in parenting, marriages, work, school, speech, our money, our media, and our time. So that we will be filled with fruits of righteousness would mean that our lives would produce good things that point others to Christ. It's God's plan to use you and I to show the world God's true nature and character, that all may know this abounding love from God, and to let our love abound in the world. Last week I was watching a webinar about sharing faith with children. Religious church language can be confusing. One of the questions they were asking was, is there a better language that we should use around the idea of making a faith decision rather than asking Jesus to come into your heart? We've all heard those words, but have you ever considered what it might seem to a literal thinker? I don't know if I want to have a tiny Jesus to come and be in my heart and run around in there. I mean, do you get a tiny Jesus to run around in your heart and you get a tiny Jesus and you get a tiny Jesus? You could see how this would be problematic. Well, the proposed linguistic solution, a wise alternative I thought, was to invite people, especially children, to instead choose to follow Jesus. That's what Jesus asked of the first disciples, and it's what he asks of us, come and follow me. So as we consider what it means to love today, we're going to look at the ways that Jesus offered abounding love and see if we can follow his lead. So what did Jesus' abounding love look like? Jesus' love offers radical welcome. Jesus was teaching, and he called a little child to him and placed the child among them, and he said, "Truly, I tell you, unless you become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the position of this child is greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." From Matthew 18. And in Matthew 19, people brought little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them and pray for them. But the disciples rebuked them. And Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these." And when he had placed his hands on them, he went from there. When we welcome new babies into our church family and their parents bring them to dedicate them, it's so easy to offer them welcome and love. Who doesn't want to love a tiny, innocent baby? But at what point, under what conditions, does that welcome end? When that child struggles to conform to the social norms of the group? When they begin to test the boundaries and express their own opinions? When they question injustices they see in the world that also play out in the church? I surely hope not. The example of Jesus to welcome the children didn't come with conditions, age stipulations, or requirements of behavioral norms. When we dedicate our children, we commit as a congregation that we will come alongside parents in the journey of raising those children. And we don't just mean when they're tiny babies, yet unable to express their own opinions. So let us welcome all of God's children with abounding love. Jesus' abounding love wasn't just friendly or tolerant, though. He didn't just welcome people from a safe distance and let them listen from the margins. Jesus' abounding love sat down and ate with and took interest in those who were on the margins, the outcast and the lost. And it wasn't always popular. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake, and a large crowd had gathered around him, and he began to teach. And as he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, who was sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. Then Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, and many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And when the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with these sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Mark chapter 2. The church people were the ones looking on in disapproval. But there was no fear here. Jesus wasn't afraid of the lost or the sinner or the one in need of grace. He sat, ate, taught, and rejoiced right alongside. He generously offered friendship and forgiveness, but it didn't require a request for forgiveness before Jesus sat, ate, and befriended. This parable calls on us to practice hospitality to all and to ask ourselves, who do I include and who do I exclude and why? With Jesus' example, there's abundance, plenty to go around for everyone, so no one has to be left out or pushed to the margin wondering if they have a place, if they're in or out. Abounding love makes room for everyone, and there is still more than enough. In college, there was a popular late-night spot where we'd go after worship at the Baptist Student Union called The Grit. It was as grungy as it sounds. The booths and the tables were greasy, but they were big, so it didn't matter how many people came along. There was always room at the table. We'd squeeze in a little tighter, we'd pull up another chair, we'd share the space with people all crowding in. It was chaotic and loud and sometimes messy, and the food wasn't even all that great, but there was an abundance of welcome and grace and hospitality there. There was quite the diversity of people who crowded around those tables. They represented all socioeconomic statuses, all races, all political affiliations. There were city kids and country kids and those who'd never missed a week of Sunday school and others who'd never been to church before. Every major and interest and theological position was represented around the table. Looking back, there was a whole lot more that could have divided us than united us. But the thing that brought us together was Jesus. We were all fellow followers trying to live and love like Jesus did. It seemed a lot simpler then, But among those kids who would welcome anyone and scoot over to pull up another chair for whomever wanted to come along, that was a place where Jesus was, and where Jesus' kind of abounding love was. So Jesus' love welcomed, but not from afar. He sat down and he spent time with people, and then Jesus took it even farther than that. Jesus' abounding love calls us to love even our enemies. Jesus often called upon people to love. It was the moral norm for God's people. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said, people will know that you're my disciples by your love. But this kind of abounding love didn't stop with just love for our neighbor, but it is the love that expects us to love even our enemies. Jesus said, love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you and pray for those who mistreat you. Love your enemies. Do good to them and lend to them without expecting anything back. And then your reward will be great and you will be children of the Most High. Because He is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Have you ever heard of Louis Zamperini? He was an American Olympian, the youngest at the time to compete in the 5,000-meter race at age 19. While he didn't win the 1936 Olympics, he did well and became well known. A few years later, he joined the military and was fighting in World War II when his plane went down over water. Against odds, he survived the crash and found a life raft. He climbed in and drifted for 47 days, battling sharks and the sea until he was taken captive by Japanese soldiers. He was taken to a place called Execution Island, where he was held prisoner, caged, beaten, and starved, especially under the reign of one particular camp guard, the Bird, who knew of his racing fame and tortured him relentlessly. When the war ended, Louis had survived and was able to go home, and he got married, and things seemed better for Louis, but he was consumed by nightmares every night that haunted him and that drove him to alcoholism. As his marriage was on the brink of divorce, his wife convinced him to go with her to a Billy Graham crusade. That night, he decided to follow Jesus and was convicted to forgive his tormentors. It was the very first night after he'd been home from the war that he didn't have nightmares, nor did they return any day after that. Shortly after Louis decided to follow Jesus, he felt convicted to return to Japan, to meet with Japanese war criminals and offer them forgiveness. He showed love and concern for the enemies who had once caused him great struggle. Louis is a testament to the power of loving your enemies and the kind of healing that comes from forgiveness. That kind of forgiveness is really only possible with Jesus' kind of abounding love. We may have true enemies, as Louis did, but we probably don't have long lists of people who have sought to end our lives. But we can start by treating our enemies as people beloved by God, made in the image of God, doing good to them, even forgiving them for their wrongs against us. And from there, we can lead the healing to God's love at work within us. This all sounds like a pretty tall task. We must welcome all, and not just welcome them, but then we have to sit alongside them and get to know them, and then we must even offer love to our enemies. It sounds like a lot, and it could seem like it's overwhelming, exhausting even. But Jesus' abounding love, while it does call us to action, it also offers us rest. We don't have to do it all in our own strength. We can't do it all on our own. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Doing the work of loving abundantly as Jesus did doesn't promise to be easy or simple or something we can simply think about when it's convenient or add it to our to-do list and check it off. Jesus' good news does invite action, but it also offers us rest. When our souls are weary, when we're beaten down and tired, when we need to be the one who needs to be cared for, Jesus cares for us and invites us to unload our burdens and let His love lighten our load. Brené Brown's latest book, Atlas of the Heart, seeks to give language to all of the emotional connections possible between human beings. Her chapter on love says, love is not something that we can get or give, but something that we nurture and grow. A connection that can be cultivated between two people only when it exists within each of them. We can only love others as much as we love ourselves. That might be true for relationships between two humans, but when we're talking about our love with the divine, we are already known fully deeply and completely. There's nothing that's hidden from God and nothing we can do or not do that will change God's profound love for us. We are given God's love freely, and God enables us to share it abundantly. Now, how we do that is up to us to nurture and let it grow. But God is love, so on God's side of the exchange, it's always abounding. That girl with all the flower bouquets on Valentine's Day, that girl was my sister. All of those flower bouquets, all 4 of them, shriveled up and died, just like all 4 of those college relationships. They weren't nurtured and cultivated. They didn't keep growing because they'd been cut off at the roots. But my sister did find the one, and they got married, and together they're growing a family, and they're also growing lilies in their yard. They do nurture them and water them. They bloom, and then they die away until the next year when they return. Those lilies had grown so dense that last year they had to split them, divide the bulbs, and give some away because they were abounding. May it be said of our love that it will grow to be so welcoming, so freely given and invested in others, so profoundly different than that which is seen in the world, even toward our enemies, that when we need to rest, our love will still